So I will now welcome on stage the USA Consul General in Naples, Ms. Tracy Robert Pounds. So I give her the floor. Thank you.
Good morning. Buongiorno. Can you hear me okay? I have to say, I'm already a big fan of this event. It's the first time in Italy in 14 months I've been able to give a speech in English, so it's very exciting for me. No one has to suffer through my Italian accent to try and understand what I mean. Thank you so much for inviting me and the consulate to participate in the second edition of the EDI Global Forum for Education and Integration. And thank you all for coming today. I think it's going to be a very exciting discussion, and we're privileged to be a part of it. The U.S. mission in Italy and the Consulate General in Naples are delighted to support Fondazione Morra Greco for this event, which really involves leading creative figures from the United States and all over the world. The United States and Italy are committed to sharing knowledge and promoting dialogue about topics that the EDI Global Forum helps to advance, such as diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. We are proud that there are so many U.S. cultural institutions and American professionals represented here today as part of this international network that endeavors to link artistic practices and education in innovative ways. Against that backdrop, I'm delighted to introduce to the forum today Professor Jeffrey Schnapp, a professor at Harvard who specializes in the intersection of internet and society, media history, curatorial practices, and futurism. He also founded the MetaLab at Harvard, an idea hub for digital humanities. Professor Schnapp's work includes collaborations with the Fondazione Donna Regina here in Naples and the Triennale di Milano, among other distinguished institutions. His collaborative Trento Tunnels project, which I would really like to go and see, a 6,000 square meter pair of highway tunnels in northern Italy repurposed as a history museum, was featured in the Italian pavilion of the 2010 Venice Biennale of Architecture and featured at the Maxi in Rome in Recycle. I'm also happy to introduce this morning to you Professor Bruno Siciliano, Professor of Control and Robotics and Director of the Prisma Lab in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Information Technology at the University of Naples. His research interests include identification and adaptive control and the role of robotics in the human environment to improve communities' quality of life. Thank you again for the opportunity to welcome our guests and to be a part of this morning's events. Without much additional delay, I give the floor over to our distinguished speakers this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to start just by thanking the Fondazione, all the organizers. It's a wonderful event in such a splendid context. And some of the points that I'm going to touch on in this brief talk, 15 minutes, are very pertinent to what the first panel, the kinds of questions that the first panel was touching upon. And I will try to be synthetic in them, but what I want to say above all is I was trained as a cultural historian. I work as a design practitioner and curator, and also am involved in the field of robotics. And working across such a wide range of areas, one of the things that I kind of live in an everyday sense is just how artificial the sort of bifurcations are that were being touched upon in the first panel. For me, technology is culture, and culture is technology. And those divisions that we inherited from the early post-World War II period, from C.P. Snow and others, I think the digital age has collapsed them very substantially. So I think the enterprise that was being described by my colleagues earlier is a really important one, which is to understand what it means, not to observe these segregated, siloed models, but to really think across those divides. And that's very much in the spirit of what I want to say today about museums. The lab that I run at Harvard, the MetaLab, we call ourselves an idea foundry, because everything we do starts with ideas, with research problems, with questions. Ideation is at the core of every project, not technology per se, but rather ideas, a problem, an issue, a question, an exciting opportunity. A knowledge design laboratory, we try to look at questions of new models of knowledge production and new ways of expressing forms of knowledge that are emergent forms, that don't have natural relationships to the containers that we inherited from the past. And third, a production studio. We try to make stuff, deliver stuff. And in that context, museums and curatorial practice for me have become really important. I didn't start out as a curator or as somebody obsessed with museums, but I became one because I realized that museums have a very deep history of thinking about how we express knowledge. We transform knowledge into an object of experience. And that's much of what we do in the digital realm can be described as such. So in these brief remarks, I'm going to talk about a museum as a platform, in part because what I really love about platforms is that a platform is a kind of empty space. It's a space that has a function, but that function is always under negotiation. There isn't a single response to what a platform does. It facilitates and enables, but what? Under what circumstances? With what objectives? And what I mean as a provocation, as a thought piece for this conversation, is really to rethink some of the basic aspects of the model of museology that we inherited from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, which is to say, to think about museums as institutions and platforms that are built not around collections, not around this, of course, however important collections are, but around connections. What do we do with collections? How do we activate and animate them? The mission of stewardship, conservation, and the preservation and construction of cultural memory is, of course, fundamental to what a museum is, and certainly it's an honorable and noble endeavor, but it's not a sufficient definition of what a museum is. And I think the digital age has opened up for us the possibility to really think about museums, especially as spaces for, and I'm going to underscore the word advanced research, training, experimentation, and programming that pose questions, open up problems, and expose new critical horizons. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean in that regard in the context of 5 prompts, 5 provocations, if you like, 5 channels of thought about this issue of how a museum could serve as a platform, as a node for connections, as much as it honors its obligation to collections. And I'll just say one last thing, which is something I'd like to say to museum directors all the time as a provocation, which is human beings are hoarders. We're very good at collecting. We're very bad at doing something with those collections. I come from Harvard University. We have collections that are amazing, that tell all kinds of stories about the history of civilization, about the present, the past. We don't do anything with most of them. They sit and they gather dust. And cultural heritage that sits in storage is not heritage. It's not alive. It isn't part of knowledge production memory. So we have to really tackle this question in some creative and innovative ways. And the digital transformation that we're living through, which we're only at the beginning of, opens up some powerful horizons for rethinking what these basic institutions are. That's the focus of my remarks. So the first point I want to make is a provocation, which is the museological culture that we inherited from the 20th century is very product-oriented. It creates beautiful objects of experience. We spend huge amounts of time carefully, and by the way, I love everything about exhibitions. I've curated 20 exhibitions. These are some exhibitions that I've curated. I've curated exhibitions in highway tunnels. I've curated exhibitions in major museums. I love everything about the process. Going into the storeroom, selecting works, writing wall labels, crafting spatial narratives, designing interactive experiences. They're all wonderful things to do, but the kind of obsession with production values, with getting everything airtight and perfectly right, with constructing an experience that has no pores, that has no openings, as wonderful a tradition as that is, it also is a kind of dead end, and it tends to lower the degree of engagement on the part of audience. So I'm making an argument here, not for products, but for processes, for moving our concept of even exhibition events away from this idea of a product that's served up in the experience economy, towards something that's more open-ended, more porous, more available to forms of engagement. And that's the reason why I think it's important for us to reorient our thinking about what an exhibition is or what a museum is as a platform towards the presentation of problems, not solutions, which is a contrary to the instinct of every curator. Audiences love problems. They love to look at fakes side by side with original works. They love to see debate, and we don't often open up those windows. And when we do open up those windows, we open up the museum to become a space for research and experimentation. It's a different vision. Second point, museum education. We need to re-educate museum education. Museum education was born in 1906 at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts as a top-down model for how people with knowledge would share that knowledge with less educated, less well-informed members of the population to democratize access to museums. This is a great, beautiful idea, but at the same time, it has devolved into a model of education that's focused on 12-year-olds. And I have a 12-year-old. I love 12-year-olds. But museums can do much, much more in the realm of education. Their collections tell such an incredible, rich set of stories that cross every disciplinary boundary. And when we limit those stories to essentially taking objects under very limited conditions and then essentially translating them into language that's available, that's accessible to a very small segment of the population, typically younger people, we miss the larger opportunity that museums have to be a platform for education, and not just education, but knowledge production for research. This is where the museum was born, and I think it's where the museum needs to come back to. I don't just preach this, but I've practiced it here with the Museo Madre. We did an experiment a couple of years ago when the museum was closed, when the museum world was closed during the pandemic. We had an idea, which was, let's think about what museums could or should be through a hands-on project. It was called Museo Futuro. We invited 25 young professionals in their 20s and 30s who are not curators, not art historians, but people involved in technology, creative fields, communications. And we got almost 700 applications. We chose 25 people, and we had an online seminar where we went week by week, speculatively, around these 10 themes, reimagining what a museum could be, and recurating the collections at the level of single objects, and also a broader vision of the institution. So a kind of macro and micro scale. And this project, I have to say, was an experiment, of course. But it's an experiment that was fascinating because what it produced were a series of curatorial propositions from people who aren't professional curators, but who have professional knowledge and skills that they applied to engaging in forms of deep analysis of objects that are not on view. They're in storage, trying to figure out strategies for activating them, strategies for connecting them, for building networks within the collections, using these different kind of broad concepts as an experiment. And our idea was to actually literally implement the outcome of these experiments in an exhibition event. My point is simply that at an advanced level, these are all people with advanced degrees, with professional practices, to engage that broader community in the larger conversation about what a museum could or should be is a powerful way to activate collections and also to propose conflicting and contrasting and dialogical ways of engaging with the very works that the institution is a custodian of. Many of the people who are involved in this process, their careers have been changed subsequently, which is exactly what the objective should be, I think. A third point I want to touch upon is a question that's an ontological question, which is what a cultural object, what an object of knowledge is today. We tend to think of the answer to that question being continuous, but the reality is that every object that's in a storehouse of a museum today is in fact a data object as well. It has a whole halo of information points that surround it. This was always true, but it's particularly true now. We're looking here at the database of the Harvard Art Museum, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But every cultural object is not a kind of single unicum, but rather it's a social network of other objects that tell stories about collecting, that tell stories about acquisitions, that tell stories about materials, that tell stories about geography, and so forth. So to exhibit an object, we can adopt the old approach, which we see on the Museum of Modern Art New York site, where a Bialetti Express coffee maker is displayed as if it were a Rembrandt. Author, creator, date. Now, of course, that's a representation that falls into certain conventions of wall labeling in museums, but the Amazon representation is so much richer. We have a whole community of people who are telling stories about what is a Mocha Express, how do you use it, how do you replace the guarnizione, 15 other coffee makers, the many sizes. And every cultural object today, like every form of scientific discourse, is part of a network of communications. So when it comes to museum displays, we have to think increasingly about not how to make the experience of a physical object so busy that we can't see it, but how to design experiences that allow visitors to interact with that rich halo of materials that actually tell the story of the object. So let's take an example here. These are archaeological fragments from the 5th century BC of a ritual in ancient Greek society which we call today ostracism. In other words, when somebody became uncomfortable to the polis in ancient Athens, there were rituals, voting procedures to send them into exile. In this case, these are pottery shards. The Greeks never threw anything away. When they broke their vases, they kept the fragments. And what you can see is these are inscribed with a name. People, members of the citizenship, were voting to send into exile Themistocles, the great 5th century BC leader. Now, these ostraka, as they are referred to, are fascinating objects. They're pieces of pottery, the kinds of pots you see on exhibition whole. They're also voting, they're like little Post-it notes. And hundreds and hundreds of these were found in excavation sites in the northern slope of the Parthenon. But these are not objects that a normal person can walk up to and understand. They require a whole apparatus that allows you to see more than them, to interact with. So here's just a sketch of a project we did at the MetaLab many years ago, just trying to imagine what would a record look like where you could see the scholarly conversation among experts who read Demotic Greek script, who have reconstructed the physical location and seen the relationship between these objects. In other words, a model of how that object could be brought alive. How you would install that in a physical site, those are all design questions, but I think they begin to point in the direction also of a model where you could even create forms of artifactual interfaces where the information is embedded in the object in a way that we don't imagine in a conventional museological type solution. These are just pointers in the direction of a model of how museums can play this role that advances and presents and captures advanced knowledge and even exposes debates and conflicts and discussions about the interpretation of objects. And this process doesn't have to consist only in the adding of layers of digital information. I'm showing you here Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's 1930 light prop for an electric stage, one of what's sometimes described as the first works of kinetic sculpture. It's actually not a sculpture at all. As the Guggenheim showed in its exhibition, it was actually a theater prototype. So at the MetaLab, we had this idea, just because the Harvard Art Museum owns 2 copies of this sculpture. One is a perfect replica. It's actually better than the original, and it owns the original. So we had this idea, wouldn't it be interesting to show how the sculpture lives by planting little micro cameras inside the light prop? So that a viewer of the object can actually really live inside it like an actor, because Moholy-Nagy's concept was that this was a theater machine. This was not a sculpture to be viewed at a certain distance. It's just an example of how a small technology gesture can place you in a different relationship. I'll close with two points. Collections databases. Whereas once upon a time, everybody had long inventory books itemizing the objects that are in their collections. Today, every museum inventories its materials through databases. And databases are powerful research tools, except they have to be accessible to researchers through application programming interfaces. As far as I know, there isn't a single museum in Italy that has an application, an API that's open to researchers. So Italy is a superpower in the cultural field. We have tremendous resources, but researchers can't activate these collections at a macro scale without databases that are accessible and usable and well architected for laboratory use. This is the kind of experimentation that my lab does a lot of. We ran a project called Curatorial Agents, which is a collaboration between an AI, machine learning-based approach, and the Harvard Art Museum collections. And you can do very cool and strange things. I'm just showing you quickly. This is a project where we extracted the directionality of the gaze in paintings, photographs, sculptures, coins, and ceramics, and created a map that allows you to navigate 10,000 objects through which way a human subject is looking, up, down, right, left, to create an experience that you can't have on a one-to-one basis, because this is an experience that makes sense at scale. And it's these kinds of endeavors that are opened up by the availability of APIs that allow us to work with collections databases and to ask collections databases research questions, as well as to design new kinds of experiences. So I want to close with a kind of a trip to the future, which is also a trip to the past. What was a museum? Where did the concept of museum come from? Well, if we read Strabo, the Greek geographer's description of what a museum is, it was a campus. It wasn't a place just where visual objects were featured or certain media were featured. It was a place with a library. It was a place you walked around. It was a place of performance, of live performance especially, of oration, of theatrical performance. And I think the challenge that we face today is to start beginning to rethink the museum as a more integrative place, where these kinds of media that we've segregated over the course of the rise of 19th century and 20th century practices begin to re-aggregate themselves as networks that are interconnected and that speak to one another. So museum as platform means going back to a moment where we're thinking about an institution that is always in process, that is not a point of arrival, but it's a perpetual work in progress. Thank you.